The Flaxborough Summer Flower and Produce Exhibition had, for 23 consecutive years, begun with the same sequence of events: a trumpet voluntary from the local school band, a speech from the mayor involving an inappropriate pun about marrows, and the presentation of a silver cup to the person whose begonias had most successfully defied the laws of God and soil. This year promised no departure from that venerable formula, until Mrs. Gwendolen Broadspear's fainting spell. It was not a dramatic collapse. Mrs. Broadspear was far too genteel for that. She merely turned pale, uttered a small "oh," and folded neatly to the ground beside her dahlias, which had, according to rumour, been coaxed with gin and tonic water. The crowd gasped with the kind of excitement that only very mild calamity can provide. When she was revived by Mrs. Glossop, who had the rare privilege of owning smelling salts, there was a small but audible murmur that the widow's gold ring, the one she wore suspended from a fine chain about her neck, had vanished. "It was there not half an hour ago," Mrs. Glossop declared, clutching her gloves with moral indignation. "I noticed it when she was judging the cucumbers." Such a tasteful piece, considering her bereavement. Mrs. Broadspear, whose natural instinct was to dramatize even discomfort, looked down and gave a small theatrical cry. "My ring! My Ernest ring! It's gone!" By that evening, what had begun as an unfortunate feint had evolved, through successive layers of retelling, into a crime of considerable gravity. Inspector Pubright first heard of it from Sergeant Love, who entered the station office with a grin suggesting entertainment rather than outrage. "Flower show burglary," Love announced, depositing his notebook on the desk. "Widow Broadspear claims someone's pinched her late husband's wedding ring," during the prize announcements no less. Pubright, who was reading a report on road safety signage, raised his head. "A ring stolen at the event?" "So she says. Could have fallen off, of course. Or been mislaid in the excitement of fainting." Love allowed the possibility of misplacement to linger, but his grin implied that mischief, not accident, was the likelier explanation. "Any suspects?" Pubright asked mildly, the usual crowd. Her maid was helping with the flower arrangements, the vicar's wife hovering nearby, and that gardener fellow, Moss, I think, was seen loitering. "Loitering," Pubright repeated. "At a flower show," Love shrugged. "According to Mrs. Glossop, he looked shifty, though she uses that word for anyone not in a hat." Pubright closed the report and leaned back, gazing thoughtfully out the window where the afternoon drizzle streaked the glass like grey lace. "You'd better take down a few statements," he said, "but remind them gently that gossip is not admissible as evidence." Love smiled. "In Flaxborough, sir, that leaves us very little indeed." By the next morning, the Flaxborough Gazette had elevated the story to front-page status. "Outrage at flower show. Widow's ring vanishes amidst chaos." The accompanying photograph showed Mrs. Broadspear reclining in her sitting room, expression tragic, while the chain around her neck dangled empty, a small, theatrical symbol of loss. The article described the incident as a brazen theft conducted in full daylight before numerous witnesses, though the witnesses, when interviewed, mostly recalled the quality of the cakes or the mayor's unfortunate pun. Mrs. Broadspear lived in a house that smelled faintly of lavender, linoleum and grievance. When Pubright called upon her that afternoon, she greeted him with the subdued martyrdom of one who knows she is providing the town's entertainment. "I cannot imagine," she said, folding her lace handkerchief, "what sort of person would stoop so low. Ernest's ring was of no monetary value, Inspector." "Only sentimental." "Sentiment," Pubright murmured, "is often more tempting than gold." She blinked. "You mean—" "I mean," he said mildly, "that sometimes people desire what others cherish, rather than what others possess." Mrs. Broadspear regarded him uncertainly, unsure whether she was being comforted or examined. "I do hope," she said, recovering her dignity, that you will proceed with utmost discretion. It would be too dreadful if this were to become talk of the town." Pubright smiled faintly. "I am afraid, madam, that particular horse has already left the stable and is halfway down the high street." When he left the house, the afternoon was closing into mist. The hedgerows dripped quietly. A cat darted under a garden wall. Pubright paused on the pavement, glancing once at the small brass nameplate on the gate. Mrs. G. Broadspear. Widow. He noticed, with the faintest flicker of interest, that the chain around her neck, still empty, had not the polished look of daily wear. Perhaps, he thought, not all symbols of devotion were as faithfully displayed as claimed. He buttoned his coat and, in his mild, unhurried way, began to wonder not who had stolen the ring, but why it had been worth stealing at all. By the following morning, the theft of Mrs. Broadspear's ring had become, in the eyes of Flaxborough, an outrage of near-biblical proportions. That such a thing could occur in the town hall annex, where tea was always served in bone china, and one removed one's hat, even to sneeze, was more than shocking. It was modern. At the Cardew tea rooms, that crucible of local opinion, 3 retired ladies were already revising the details. "I heard," said Mrs. Glossop, leaning forward as though to protect the confidence she was broadcasting to the entire café, "that the ring was not stolen at all. It was swapped." "Swapped?" repeated Miss Peebles, who enjoyed words that promised moral complexity. "Yes," Mrs. Glossop continued. "Apparently the one she wears now isn't Ernest's ring at all. It's a cheap imitation brass or something." "I expect the maid knows more than she lets on." Mrs. Broom, whose husband had once served on the parish council, pursed her lips. "Well, I always thought that maid looked sly. All that quietness. Never trust a girl who doesn't chatter, I say." Miss Peebles nodded. "And crying behind the church hall after the judging Mrs. Glossop saw her?" "I did indeed," said Mrs. Glossop, pleased. "Though whether from guilt or common nerves, I couldn't say. Still, she was crying." By the time the conversation reached the bakery queue, Ivy the maid had not only stolen the ring, but pawned it to finance an elopement with the gardener. By lunchtime, the vicar's wife had been added as a possible accomplice, and by tea-time, a general consensus formed that Mrs. Broadspear herself had probably exaggerated the whole matter for attention. Flaxborough possessed a genius for conspiracy in small doses. Inspector Pubright, meanwhile, was having tea with the superintendent, a man of greater girth than imagination, who regarded all crimes as either drunkenness, jealousy, or something to do with those blasted youths. "Widow's trinket gone missing," the superintendent said. "Hardly a case for Scotland Yard, eh?" "Probably not," Pubright agreed mildly, stirring his tea, "though thefts from respectable households have a way of spreading discomfort, especially when sentiment is involved," the superintendent snorted. "Sentiment's what they call vanity these days." "Indeed," Pubright murmured, "and vanity what they call reputation." He was dismissed with a wave of the hand. Keep it quiet, make the right noises, and left to the greater efficiency of human nature, which rarely required official encouragement to complicate itself. The first statement came from Ivy Briggs, age 21, maid to Mrs. Broadspear for the past 2 years. She arrived at the station red-eyed, clutching her handbag as if afraid it, too, might be confiscated. "I didn't take it, sir," she said, before even sitting down. "I swear I didn't," Pubright nodded sympathetically. "I believe you, Miss Briggs. But we must establish what you did see. You were arranging flowers near Mrs. Broadspear at the time?" "Yes, sir. The dahlias. I'd just fetched them from the vicarage garden. Did you notice anything unusual before she fainted?" Ivy hesitated. "Only that she kept touching the chain round her neck. Like she wanted people to see it. She said it was Ernest's ring and she'd never take it off, not till her dying day." Pubright tilted his head. "Curious promise for a widow." The girl looked uncertain whether to laugh. "She said it a lot, sir, especially when Mr. Wykes was nearby, Councillor Wykes." "Yes, sir. He kept talking to her about the mayor's speech, but I thought, well, he looked uncomfortable." "Kept looking at the ring, he did," Pubright smiled faintly. Men often do when sentiment becomes public property. Later that afternoon, Councillor Basil Wykes, a short man with ambitious sideburns and the conversational habits of a parrot, arrived at the police station without invitation. "I say, Inspector," he began, "I do hope you're not taking this ring business too seriously. Entirely a storm in a teacup. Widow Broadspear's inclined to dramatics. Always has been. Likes to imagine she's still the belle of the Horticultural Society." Pubright offered him a chair. "You were present at the moment of her fainting, I believe?" "Well, yes, though I'd stepped aside to, assist with the cucumber judging. Most impressive specimens this year." "Indeed." Wykes crossed his legs nervously. "If you ask me, it's that maid of hers." Shifty eyes. "Never says a word." "Probably a kleptomaniac." "Probably," said Pubright, his tone neither agreeing nor denying. "Tell me, Councillor, do you recall the chain she wore, the one that held the ring? Gold, wasn't it? Rather ostentatious considering her station." "I can't abide sentimentality in public," Pubright nodded. "And yet you stood beside her during the presentation?" Wykes's hand twitched toward his collar. "Pure coincidence, Inspector. Pure coincidence." That evening, at the Crown and Cushion, conversation turned inevitably to the scandal. Farmers, shopkeepers, and a pair of railway porters debated motives with the precision of a courtroom and the logic of a pantomime. "Mark my words," said Mr. Beebe. "The butcher? If it were me, I'd look at no further than the gardener. They're all the same. Hands in the soil and in other people's pockets." A small laugh went around the bar. "I heard," said someone else, "that the ring wasn't hers to begin with. Belonged to a business partner of the late Mr. Broadspear. Something about debts." "No, no," interrupted the publican. "It was her husband's first wife's ring. She kept it for spite." "First wife?" said Beebe. "How many did the old goat have?" "Depends who you ask," replied the publican dryly. By nightfall, Inspector Pubright had compiled a folder of statements so mutually contradictory that they almost formed a truth by elimination. The maid was innocent, the councillor evasive, the widow performative, and the town collectively delighted. He sat in his office, the lamplight yellow and still, turning over a small detail from Ivy's statement. She kept touching the chain, like she wanted people to see it. Not a gesture of possession, he thought, but of exhibition. A declaration, perhaps, intended for a particular observer. He smiled faintly. In Flaxborough, theft was seldom about property. It was about display, and some displays were meant less to preserve memory than to provoke it. By the following morning, Flaxborough's interest in the vanished ring had reached a kind of moral fever. It was not that the townsfolk demanded justice. They demanded clarity. In a place so carefully arranged around decency and decorum, uncertainty was intolerable. If no one could say who had stolen the ring, they would at least say who might have. Inspector Pubright, by contrast, relished uncertainty. It gave people room to reveal themselves. He began with Mrs. Broadspear. The widow received him in her drawing-room, a place of lace, antimacassars, and dim photographs of men who had once been important. In the gas-board, she was dressed in what she called morning grey, a tea colour that might have seemed funereal had it not been so determinedly fashionable. "I do hope," she began, "that dreadful business yesterday hasn't caused undue inconvenience." "I told Sergeant Love everything, though he did seem awfully amused," Pubright smiled. "Sergeant Love has a simple faith in humanity, Mrs. Broadspear. He tends to believe that where theft occurs, there must be either poverty or drink." She gave a polite laugh, not certain whether to be flattered or insulted. Purbright's eyes rested briefly on the chain that still hung about her neck, now empty but polished to brightness. "You've worn that for some years, I think?" "Oh, yes," she said with a sigh that could have been rehearsed. "Since dear Ernest passed on, his ring was the one token I could never part with." "Quite so," Pubright said. "May I ask, had you ever removed it?" Mrs. Broadspear's lips pressed together. "Never, Inspector." "Not even for bathing?" Purbright's gaze lingered for a moment on her hands. Perfectly manicured, faint traces of lilac soap. "That is admirable devotion," he murmured. "And yet, oddly, the chain appears to have been replaced recently." The clasp looks new, her eyes flickered. "Oh, that. I had it repaired last month?" "Purely precautionary." "Of course," said Purbright, rising smoothly. "I do hope the chain itself was insured." She looked startled. "The chain?" "Yes, sentiment being what it is. People often overlook the practical." As he left, he could feel her eyes on his back, sharp and worried, as though the word insured had touched something raw. Next, he visited Ivy Briggs, who had returned to her small room behind the kitchen, where a gas heater sighed like an old cat. She seemed exhausted, less from guilt than from the exhausting work of appearing innocent. "I keep thinking they're all looking at me, sir," she said. "In the shops, I mean." "Like they're waiting for me to buy something expensive." Purbright's tone was kind. "I expect they'll move on to the next scandal by Friday." "They usually do." "I wish they would, sir." She hesitated, twisting her apron. "You don't think I did it, do you?" "I think," Purbright said carefully, "that people sometimes misunderstand what's valuable." She looked puzzled. "I only cleaned it once a week, sir." "Her ring, I mean." "She wouldn't let me polish it, said it was sacred. But I've seen her take it off once or twice." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" She'd look in the mirror and hold it up, like she was remembering something. "Once she even cried, sir. But not the kind of crying that's sad or more angry, like she hated it." He regarded her with quiet interest. "You're a very observant young lady, Miss Briggs. I've to be, sir," she said simply. "In that house, if you don't notice things, you get blamed for them." From the widow's house, Purbright made his way to the rectory, where Mrs. Cramble, the vicar's wife, was preparing sandwiches for a charity luncheon. She greeted him with the weary benevolence of a woman used to both God's mysteries and the town's. "Such a dreadful business," she said, slicing cucumber with moral purpose. "Poor Mrs. Broadspear, though I can't help thinking she does enjoy the attention." "Attention is often the last luxury of widowhood," Purbright replied mildly. Mrs. Cramble sniffed. Quite so. Still, it's odd about that ring." "Her husband's funeral, you know. I remember it clearly." "She didn't wear it then?" Purbright paused. "She didn't? No. She had some sort of brooch instead." "A dreadful thing. Rhinestones, I think. I noticed because she kept telling people about Ernest's beloved ring, yet it was nowhere in sight." "I assumed she'd misplaced it at the time." "Or found another use for it?" Purbright murmured. Mrs. Cramble blinked. "I beg your pardon." He smiled gently. Nothing. "Do go on." His last visit that afternoon was to Arthur Moss, the gardener who had tended the flower show arrangements. Moss was a wiry man, perpetually sunburnt, who smelled faintly of earth and suspicion. "Ring, is it?" he said when Purbright explained his visit. "Never saw it, sir. Didn't look much, truth be told. Flowers were enough to mind." "You were arranging the dahlias, I believe," Purbright said. "Quite close to Mrs. Broadspear at the time," Moss grunted. "She likes to give orders. Told me how to hold the stems. Wouldn't trust a man who's dug more soil than she's stepped on." "Did you notice her fainting?" "Hard to miss," Moss said dryly. "Though I'd say it were more a swooning. Never seen anyone fall so tidily. If you ask me, she fainted for effect." Purbright's eyebrows lifted. "Effect?" "Oh, you know the type, sir. Likes to be noticed. Funny thing is, I saw her fiddling with that chain just before she went down. Thought she might have dropped something. But after she came round, she didn't seem all that upset till folks started staring." "That's very observant, Mr. Moss." The gardener shrugged. "When you work with plants, sir, you get used to seeing what people don't say." Back at the station, Purbright reviewed his notes with the same calm precision he might have applied to a crossword puzzle. Each witness, in their own way, had contributed a fragment of contradiction. The widow had never removed the ring, except she had had the chain replaced. The maid had seen her remove it in secret, even hate it. The vicar's wife swore she hadn't worn it at her husband's funeral. The gardener implied the fainting had been staged. None of these things proved theft, but they did suggest that the disappearance of the ring was less an accident than a performance, and perhaps not one intended for the police at all. He turned over a fresh page in his notebook and wrote, in neat capitals, "Object vanished in public for private reasons." Then, after a moment's pause, he added, "Motive, not theft. Possibly message." He tapped the pencil once against the paper. The faintest smile touching his mouth. Flaxborough, he reflected, was never truly wicked, merely imaginative in its respectability. And imagination, in his experience, could be more dangerous than greed. It is a truth seldom written in police manuals that in every respectable town, crime must be tidy. If it cannot be prevented, it must at least be neatly explained. By Monday morning, Flaxborough had decided that the case of the missing ring was solved, not by evidence, but by consensus. The culprit, naturally, was the maid. It was an elegant conclusion, moral, symmetrical, and deliciously unthreatening. Ivy Briggs was young, poor, and too quiet to defend herself vigorously. She belonged to that class of suspects whose guilt could be discussed over sandwiches without spoiling the appetite. At the police station, Sergeant Love presented the result of his inquiries with a look of mild triumph. "Got to be the maid, sir," he declared. "Only one with opportunity and motive. Been in service 2 years, long enough to know where everything's kept. Small wages, bit of sentimentality, temptation too strong." Pubright raised an eyebrow. "Motive being money?" "Money, yes. Or envy. Mrs. Broadspear's not exactly a generous employer, I hear." Pubright leaned back in his chair. "You've heard correctly. But envy doesn't often make a thief, Sergeant. It makes a talker. And Miss Briggs strikes me as the sort of girl who'd cry before she'd steal." Love looked unconvinced. "Still, sir, the ring's missing and no one else fits the bill. None of these things proved theft, but they did suggest that the disappearance of the ring was less an accident than a performance, and perhaps not one intended for the police at all." He turned over a fresh page in his notebook and wrote, in neat capitals, "Object vanished in public for private reasons." Then, after a moment's pause, he added, "Motive, not theft. Possibly message." He tapped the pencil once against the paper. The faintest smile touching his mouth. Flaxborough, he reflected, was never truly wicked, merely imaginative in its respectability, and imagination, in his experience, could be more dangerous than greed. It is a truth seldom written in police manuals that in every respectable town, crime must be tidy. If it cannot be prevented, it must at least be neatly explained. By Monday morning, Flaxborough had decided that the case of the missing ring was solved, not by evidence, but by consensus. The culprit, naturally, was the maid. It was an elegant conclusion, moral, symmetrical, and deliciously unthreatening. Ivy Briggs was young, poor, and too quiet to defend herself vigorously. She belonged to that class of suspects whose guilt could be discussed over sandwiches without spoiling the appetite. At the police station, Sergeant Love presented the result of his inquiries with a look of mild triumph. "Got to be the maid, sir," he declared. "Only one with opportunity and motive. Been in service 2 years, long enough to know where everything's kept. Small wages, bit of sentimentality, temptation too strong." Pubright raised an eyebrow. "Motive being money?" "Money, yes. Or envy. Mrs. Broadspear's not exactly a generous employer, I hear." Pubright leaned back in his chair. "You've heard correctly. But envy doesn't often make a thief, Sergeant. It makes a talker. And Miss Briggs strikes me as the sort of girl who'd cry before she'd steal." Love looked unconvinced. "Still, sir, the ring's missing and no one else fits the bill." "Precisely," said Pubright. "No one fits, and that is always suspicious." Meanwhile, the Flaxborough Gazette devoted a second column to developments in the investigation. Though it mentioned no names, it noted that certain domestic staff had been helping police with their inquiries. The quotation marks around helping were, as usual, editorially eloquent. Mrs. Glossop read the line aloud at the tea-room. "Well, I said from the beginning she had that look," she murmured. "What look, dear?" asked Miss Peebles. "The look of someone who doesn't starch properly. In Flaxborough—" That was damning enough. At the Broadspear residence, Ivy endured the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Mrs. Broadspear had dismissed her from household duties pending the investigation, a phrase she uttered with the grandeur of a high court judge. "You will, of course, understand," she said, "that I cannot be comfortable in your presence until matters are resolved." "Yes." "Ma'am," Ivy whispered, "and though I make no accusation, it is only prudent to—" "Take precautions. Of course, ma'am. You may continue to reside in your quarters until further notice. But I think it best if the key to the silver cabinet remains in my possession." "Yes, ma'am." The repetition of ma'am was not so much respect as resignation. Pubright, observing the exchange later, thought it resembled a form of genteel punishment, one of those quiet rituals by which the middle class absolves itself through discomforting others. That afternoon he visited Ivy again. She looked pale and exhausted, her eyes reddened from tears she was too tired to hide. "I didn't take it, sir," she said, for the third time that week. "I know," said Pubright gently, "but others believe you did, and belief, Miss Briggs, is a very powerful sort of evidence in this town." She looked up, startled. "Then what can I do?" "Nothing for now." "Except tell me one more thing," she nodded nervously. "When you cleaned Mrs. Broadspear's room last week, did you happen to see a small jewellery box?" "Perhaps on her dressing table?" "Yes, sir." "She keeps one. Dark wood, little brass corners. And inside?" "I couldn't say, sir." "She never lets me near it. Though once, when she was out, I saw it open a crack. There was something else. Another ring, I think, not gold. Sort of reddish metal." Pubright considered that. "And she called the gold one Ernest's ring?" "Yes, sir." "Then whose, do you suppose, was the other?" "I don't know, sir. But when she caught me dusting near it, she slammed the lid shut and said it was nothing that concerned me." Pubright smiled faintly. Few things concern servants according to those they serve, yet most of what's worth knowing begins below stairs. He next called on Councillor Wykes, who had been seen calling on Mrs. Broadspear again, ostensibly to express sympathy. Wykes greeted Pubright with exaggerated cheerfulness. "Ah, Inspector! Still chasing that little ring?" "I dare say it's turned up by now." "I dare say it hasn't," Pubright replied evenly. "Your friendship with Mrs. Broadspear is long-standing, I believe." "Purely civic acquaintance," Wykes said quickly. "One must support local widows, you know, especially when they have influence with the Horticultural Society." "Quite. And I understand you were her late husband's executor?" The councillor's expression faltered. "Well, yes, in a minor capacity. A few papers, nothing substantial." "Did the will make mention of any personal effects?" "Rings, for instance?" I shouldn't think so," Pubright nodded. "You see, the odd thing about sentiment, councillor, is that it often conceals arithmetic. People remember affection when it happens to align with inheritance." Wykes swallowed. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," said Pubright mildly, "merely observing that the heart and the ledger often keep their accounts together." When he left, Wykes was staring out the window, blotchy and uncomfortable. That evening, Pubright met Sergeant Love at the station. The sergeant was filling out a form with the resigned energy of a man making work for the sake of it. "Nothing new, sir," he said. "The maid's clean as a whistle. No pawning, no suspicious purchases, not even a fondness for jewellery." "Excellent," said Pubright. "Then we may safely rule her in," Love blinked. "In, sir?" "Indeed. When everyone agrees so quickly, one must assume someone has provided them with a convenient answer." Love frowned. "You think someone's setting her up?" "I think," Pubright said, reaching for his hat, "that we are being offered an illusion of closure, which is the surest sign the case is still open." As he walked home through the misting evening, Pubright reflected on Flaxborough's peculiar brand of justice, a justice not of truth, but of comfort. They wanted the ring found, yes, but more than that, They wanted the world restored to its pattern. A missing object, a found culprit, a sigh of relief, a return to tea and marrows. But somewhere in the widow's house, perhaps behind a locked drawer, perhaps in a memory she dared not recall, lay something that refused to fit the pattern. Something older than a theft, and much less tidy. He stopped at the corner under the street lamp, the fog thick as breath, and murmured to himself, "If the ring was never meant to be stolen, perhaps it was meant to disappear." He smiled faintly and continued home, a figure of calm curiosity in a town that mistook quiet for peace. By Wednesday morning, the case of the vanished ring was already beginning to wilt, much like the dahlias that had started it all. Flaxborough's attention span, though powerful, was mercurial. It thrived on shock, not uncertainty. The town had reached the comfortable plateau of believing something unpleasant had happened, but no longer. Remembering quite what, Mrs. Broadspear had regained enough dignity to attend a church luncheon, where she spoke at length about violations of the sanctity of widowhood. The maid remained under the faint but ever-present cloud of suspicion. The counsellor avoided the high street, and Inspector Pubright, to all outward appearance, was doing very little indeed. He had, however, developed a quiet interest in a man named Mr. Edwin Chimes, the Flaxborough Gazette's freelance photographer. Mr. Chimes had been taking pictures at the flower show for the Gazette's society page. His artistic philosophy was simple. Everyone looks better beside a marigold. When Pubright arrived at his shop, a cramped mixture of photo studio, tobacconist, and hearing aid dealer, Chimes was polishing his camera lenses with the solemnity of a priest. "Ah, Inspector," he said, "come for a portrait." "Or a pipe?" "Neither, thank you. I understand you were photographing the flower show last Saturday." "Indeed I was. A fine event. Bit of commotion at the end, I gather." "Widow collapsing and all that?" "Quite. I wonder if you'd allow me to see the negatives." Chimes looked surprised. "The ring business?" "Thought that was all settled." "Only in the public imagination," Pubright said dryly. "I'm hoping your imagination is less eager." Chimes chuckled and fetched a stack of negatives from a cabinet. "These are the best of them. That one, there's Mrs. Broadspear just before she went down like a felled dahlia." Pubright leaned over the lightbox. The widow's image appeared ghostly, a tall, thin figure among rows of flowers, expression proud and oddly expectant. But it wasn't the widow who drew his attention. It was the faint glimmer near her collarbone, a flash of reflected light that caught the eye just before the moment of her fainting. "Curious," Pubright murmured. "What's that, Inspector?" "That reflection. Look, the light doesn't come from the sun. It's too sharp, too localized." Chimes peered closer. "Probably the flash bouncing off her chain, perhaps." "But not from her chain." Pubright pointed to the edge of the frame, where another hand, blurred but distinct, reached toward her shoulder. In its fingers, just visible, was a gleam of gold. "Well, I'll be blowed," said Chimes softly. "Someone else's hand?" "Possibly. Did you take any others?" Chimes sorted through the stack and found another, taken seconds later. The widow lying gracefully among the flowers, several faces looking down, one of them belonging unmistakably to Councillor Wykes. Pubright compared the two. The position of the councillor's right hand had changed, now half hidden behind his back. He said nothing for a long time, then, very quietly, "Would you be so kind as to make me 2 prints of these? And please, Mr. Chimes, keep this matter between us." That afternoon, Pubright called again at the Broadspear residence. The widow received him with the indulgent patience of one whose tragedy has been declared socially useful. "I hope you have some progress, Inspector," she said. "The gossip has been most tiresome. I had to remind Mrs. Glossop that fainting from grief is not a crime." "Indeed," said Pubright, sitting, "though sometimes it conceals one." Her smile faltered. "I beg your pardon." He handed her one of the photographs. Mr. Chimes was kind enough to let me see his work. You appear rather composed, considering the imminence of your swoon." She peered at it, lips tightening. "I can't say I look my best." "No one does when they're about to faint," Pubright agreed.
But look here. Do you notice that hand?"
She blinked. "What hand?" "Just beside your shoulder. Someone else's, a gentleman's, judging by the cuff. You see the glint between the fingers?"
I can't say I do," Pubright smiled pleasantly. "Perhaps not."
"But I rather think Councillor Wykes might." A silence deepened. "Tell me," Pubright said softly, "why was it so important that everyone saw that ring that day? You touched it often, didn't you?"
Almost displaying it, her composure cracked. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do."
"A widow's ring is an emblem of grief, but in your case, perhaps, also of possession."
"And sometimes possession is—"
Contested, her eyes flashed.
"You're suggesting Basil, Councillor Wykes, took it?"
"I am suggesting," Pubright said mildly, "that its disappearance may not have been an act of theft at all, but of collaboration." She rose, trembling.
"That is an outrageous insinuation."
"Indeed it is," Pubright agreed, standing.
"Which is why it may be true." He inclined his head politely and left her there.
Breathing fast, her knuckles white against the photograph, at the station, Sergeant Love met him with his usual combination of good humour and bafflement. "Another dead end, sir?" "Quite the opposite."
"A live one, though somewhat entangled." Pubright spread the two photographs on the desk.
"What do you see, Sergeant?"
Love squinted.
"That's Mrs. Broadspear, and that's Wykes. And that hand there looks like it's pinching something shiny." "Exactly. Now, imagine that what was pinched wasn't stolen but removed by mutual agreement." Love frowned.
"You mean she let him take it?"
"Or wanted him to. Either to hide it or to make it appear lost. Either way, it would make a splendid distraction, wouldn't it?" "From what?" Pubright tapped the photograph gently. "From whatever truth the ring itself represented." That evening, Flaxborough enjoyed the peculiar satisfaction of believing the case was closing. Mrs. Broadspear was seen at the vicarage, tearfully forgiving her maid. Councillor Wykes made a loud donation to the church roof fund. And Ivy Briggs, though not formally exonerated, was allowed once more to polish silver, under supervision. Pubright, however, was not comforted. He sat at his desk long after dusk, reading over the late Mr. Broadspear's probate notice, a document so dull it was almost hypnotic. Yet one clause caught his eye. "To my wife Gwendolen, I leave my personal effects, save those articles already bestowed during my lifetime upon my first wife,
Margaret Wykes." He read it again and smiled, not broadly,
but with the weary satisfaction of a man who
recognizes an old pattern. The widow's late husband had once been married to the councillor's sister.
The ring that belonged to Ernest was not a symbol of devotion at all. It was evidence of an inheritance improperly claimed, perhaps even concealed. And if the widow's display of the ring had made the councillor nervous, perhaps that was precisely her intention. He wrote in his notebook, "The ring, tut proof of prior marriage, M. Wykes." Removal arranged to avoid public humiliation. Yet why faint? Why stage the scene? He stared at the final line for a long time. Then, quietly, he underlined it twice. Pubright believed in human decency, but only as a mask. Behind every act of propriety there was always someone fainting for effect. By Thursday morning, the air over Flaxborough felt thicker, as though the weather itself were holding its breath. The gossip about the widow's ring had cooled, but something else, quieter, heavier, had replaced it. It was no longer a parlour story. It had become a silence that people stepped around. The town, Pubright reflected, was like a lace curtain, from a distance, decorous and uniform, up close, full of deliberate holes. His first call of the day was upon Mr. Cyril Blount, proprietor of Blount & Son jewellers and horologists, an establishment whose display window had not changed since the coronation. Blount himself was a man of such studied precision that he might have been wound up each morning with one of his own keys. He greeted Pubright with a smile that flickered like a clock pendulum, polite, mechanical, and faintly terrified. "Inspector, a pleasure. Though I must confess, when the police visit a jeweller, it tends to cause discomfort. I'll do my best to minimize it," said Pubright mildly. "I'm inquiring about a particular item. A gold ring, recently in the possession of Mrs. Broadspear. You've done repairs for her before?" Blount's fingers twitched. "A few times, yes.
Minor adjustments.
The chain most recently. Weak clasp. Ah, and the ring itself. Did you ever handle it?" Blount hesitated. "Once, perhaps twice. She brought it in several years ago, wanted it cleaned.
Very insistent that I not alter its shape."
"It's Ernest's ring," she said, "and must remain as he wore it." Purbright's eyes were mild.
"And did it bear an inscription?"
Blount blinked. "Well, yes, quite faint, inside the band."
"To M.W. from E.B. Not G.B.? "No, sir. M.W. I remember because she said it was a mistake. It is a jeweller's error."
"Wanted it polished out. I told her that would damage the metal." Purbright smiled thinly. "And did she insist?" "Oh, yes, but I refused. Sent her away most upset." Purbright inclined his head. "A sound decision, Mr. Blount. You've preserved more truth than you know." At the rectory, Mrs. Cramble was rehearsing hymns with the churchwarden, Mr. Eustace Kellett, a man so careful in manner that one suspected he counted the teaspoons after every funeral tea. Kellett greeted.
Pubright with the strained civility of one who believes policemen exist chiefly to make paperwork. "Terrible affair," he said.
"But of course, I've assured Mrs. Broadspear the church stands ready to forgive whoever took it." "Forgiveness," said Pubright, "is often extended most easily when one already knows the offender." Kellett blinked.
I beg your pardon?"
"You keep the parish records, I believe?" Yes. Births, deaths, marriages. Very secure, I assure you, I'm sure. Though I gather there was some disturbance last week. A cabinet found open?" Kellett stiffened.
"Ah, yes. Vandalism, we think."
"Nothing taken. Curious," said Pubright softly. "Especially as it occurred the night after Mrs. Broadspear's unfortunate fainting fit. Coincidence, surely." "Flaxborough," said Pubright, "rarely produces coincidences."
"Only connections disguised as them." Kellett's expression twitched.
"Are you implying something improper about the church's records?" "Not at all," Pubright said. "Impropriety in Flaxborough seldom originates in churches."
"Only in the people who insist on being seen there." He thanked them both and left,
humming a bar of Abide With Me. Later that afternoon he called upon Mr. Lionel Bent, a solicitor who had handled the late Mr. Broadspear's affairs. Bent's office smelled faintly of old paper and mild dishonesty. He greeted Pubright with a smile that suggested professional confidentiality, extended as far as convenience. "Always happy to help the constabulary," he said, polishing his spectacles. "Though I can't imagine how dear Ernest's will has any bearing on a lost trinket." "Probably none," said Pubright. "Unless, of course, the trinket happens to be the only surviving evidence of an earlier marriage." The spectacles paused mid-polish. "I beg your pardon?" Pubright handed him a slip of paper, a copy of the will clause he'd examined the previous night. Sister Broadspear left personal effects to his second wife, but only those not previously bestowed upon his first. "One Margaret Wykes," Bent cleared his throat. "Quite so. Routine phrasing. No implication of impropriety, indeed."
"Though it does raise a question. If the ring was given to Margaret Wykes, how did it come to be in Gwendolen Broadspear's possession?"
The solicitor smiled too quickly. "One might assume it was returned." "Returned by the late Mrs. Wykes, you mean?" "Presumably." "Rather considerate of her," said Pubright dryly, "given that she was deceased at the time." Bent went very still.
"Ah, then you've seen the death record?"
"Yes. 5 years before Mr. Broadspear remarried," the solicitor sighed.
"Inspector, I do hope you appreciate the delicacy of this. There were
misunderstandings.
Financial ones.
A property sale that went astray. The ring, you see, was symbolic. When Ernest remarried, it was thought best not to, draw attention to its history. So it was altered. I couldn't possibly say. Then allow me, said Pubright calmly. The inscription M.W. was left untouched, until Mrs. Broadspear discovered it. Then came embarrassment, outrage, perhaps jealousy. And when Councillor Wykes learned that his sister's ring was being paraded as a token of another woman's devotion, he insisted it disappear.
Am I close?
Bent dabbed his forehead.
Inspector, this town thrives on forgetting.
If you begin reminding people, you'll find yourself very unpopular. Pirbright's smile was faint and kind. Unpopularity is a police officer's most reliable compass. That evening, he took a solitary walk through the high street, the lamps dimmed by mist. The shops had closed. The town, having exhausted its moral commentary, had settled into the smug quiet of digestion. Pirbright paused outside Blount's jewellers, where the faint reflection of his own face appeared behind the glass case of rings and watches. So many tokens of love, duty, and deception. He wondered how many bore inscriptions carefully forgotten. Love joined him, hands in pockets. Evening stroll, sir? Something like that. Folk think you've given up on the case, Love said. Say you're letting it blow over. Excellent, Pirbright murmured.
A windless case is easier to examine, Love grinned. You've a theory, then?
Several, said Pirbright. All of them unpleasant. They walked in silence for a while. The sound of their shoes mingling with the faint hum of street lights. You know.
Love, Pirbright said at last. In Flaxborough.
Guilt doesn't always follow crime. Sometimes it's the other way round.
People feel guilty first, then find something to justify it. Love frowned.
You mean someone wanted the ring gone to cover up all guilt?
Not cover, said Pirbright softly. Exercise.
Like burying something twice. He looked down the empty street, where the light glimmered faintly on wet cobblestones. The trouble with respectability, he said, is that it never forgets what it pretends to. At home that night, he poured himself a modest whisky and opened his notebook again. His handwriting, neat and spare, filled only half a page. The ring. Link between two wives, two families, Kellett's break-in, Dietz access to parish marriage record, concealment. Wykes complicit, but who benefits now? Mrs. Broadspear wanted the disappearance witnessed. Why faint publicly unless the act itself was theatre? He underlined the last line, then, after a pause, added a final note, theft as confession. He closed the book, switched off the lamp, and sat for a long time in the dark, smiling faintly at the absurdity of it all. Flaxborough's sins, he reflected, were like its gardens, carefully pruned, respectably arranged and rooted in very fertile soil. Friday morning dawned with the kind of grey resignation peculiar to English market towns. The air smelled of damp hymn books and boiled cabbage. By 8 o'clock, the bells of St. Cuthbert's were ringing faintly, not for worship, but alarm. Someone had broken into the parish records office, not stolen, merely disturbed. The churchwarden, Mr. Kellett, telephoned the police station at once, his voice vibrating with the thrill of rectitude wounded.
Cabinets rifled, Inspector.
Files open, drawers ajar. It's a violation of sacred order. Pirbright arrived within the hour. The scene was curiously restrained. No smashed locks, no scattered papers, merely a faint displacement, as though someone had searched with the courtesy of a librarian. Dust lay disturbed on the floor beneath one cabinet, marked Marriages, 1920-1960. Pirbright crouched, ran a finger along the metal drawer handle. No forced entry, Kellett hovered anxiously. The side window was found unlatched.
Must have been how they got in, possibly.
Though I note, Mr. Kellett, that the latch itself is quite new, Kellett flushed.
I replaced it myself last month.
Safety measure, Pirbright smiled faintly. How very prescient of you. He opened the drawer, leafing through the alphabetical tabs until his finger stopped at B. There,
A gap, a single missing certificate. Broad spear, he murmured. Good heavens, said Kellett.
it's gone?
Apparently so, Kellett wrung his hands.
What on earth would anyone want with that? Perhaps, Pubright said mildly, to confirm that someone else shouldn't exist. By midday, the Gazette had the story, "Break-in at St. Cuthbert's, police baffled." Though the article contained little fact, it produced the desired effect, a tremor of respectable panic. Mrs. Broadspear, upon reading it, took to her bed under doctor's advice. Councillor Wykes avoided all public engagements, and Ivy Briggs, feeling the town's eyes again upon her, considered leaving Flaxborough altogether. Only Pubright seemed unmoved. That afternoon he returned to the rectory, where the vicar, Reverend Cramble, received him in the library with an expression of weary neutrality. "Between us,"
Inspector, he said, I'm not surprised.
"there's been unease in the parish lately, certain old matters being stirred.
People don't like records.
They prefer their sins biodegradable." "Quite so," said Pubright. "I gather Mrs. Broadspear's marriage certificate is missing." "Yes. Though to what end?"
I can't imagine. Perhaps to remove a trace of something inconvenient? The vicar gave him a long, cautious look.
"You mean something?"
Irregular?
Purbright's tone was mild.
Flaxborough's irregularities are rarely scandalous, Reverend. Merely misplaced, Cramble sighed.
"You suspect she was never properly married?"
I suspect, said Pubright, that she was married twice, once properly, once conveniently.
"The distinction being more moral than legal." The vicar folded his hands. "This will not end quietly, Inspector. People like their virtue embalmed, not exhumed." At the police station, Sergeant Love was sorting through the latest reports, all gossip disguised as testimony. He looked up as Pubright entered. "Any luck at the church, sir?" "Some," said Pubright. "Enough to prove the past has a burglar," Love frowned.
You think the same person took the ring and broke into the parish office?
"I think," said Pubright, "that one led inevitably to the other. Remove a ring to draw attention. Remove a document to erase it." Love whistled softly. "So the theft was a cover for something older?" "Precisely. The ring may not be valuable, Sergeant, but the marriage it represents evidently was." He handed Love the copy of the will again. "See this clause? The first wife's effects. I suspect that ring, and perhaps others, were promised to her heirs." Possibly to Councillor Wykes. Love's eyebrows rose. "So when old Ernest gave the same ring to his second wife, he created a tidy legal nuisance," Pubright finished, "and Mrs. Broadspear, realizing that, found herself in possession of both a memento and a weapon." Love grinned. "You think she was blackmailing Wykes?" "Not quite. Blackmail requires secrecy. What she wanted was acknowledgement." Love looked puzzled. "Meaning?" Pubright smiled faintly. "She wanted him to see the ring, and know she knew, publicly, hence the performance at the flower show. That evening, Pubright called unannounced at Councillor Wykes's residence, a tidy brick villa whose curtains seemed to have been trained to avoid excitement. Wykes opened the door in a silk dressing gown, expression somewhere between surprise and dread. "Inspector."
I wasn't expecting. I find the unexpected yields better conversation, said Pubright, stepping inside. I shan't keep you. Only a few questions about a missing document. Wykes swallowed.
"Document?" "The parish copy of the Broadspear marriage certificate." "I wouldn't know anything about that," he said quickly. "No, of course not. Though I note that you and Mr. Broadspear shared legal dealings some years ago, the sale of a small property, wasn't it? To cover certain losses?" The councillor's face tightened. "Entirely legitimate, I'm sure. But I wonder, did your sister Margaret ever sign over her portion?" He went pale.
That was
"Long ago, and perhaps never properly recorded," Pubright said softly, "which might explain why someone would wish to remove the record now." Wykes's mouth opened, closed, then settled into stubborn silence. Pubright regarded him kindly. "You see, Councillor, Mrs. Broadspear didn't faint from shock. She fainted from success. She'd achieved precisely what she wanted, every eye upon her, and you, specifically, reminded of what you owed her. The missing ring was her flourish, her little sermon on restitution. Wykes's jaw trembled.
You've no proof. Only photographs, Pubright said, and your reaction to them. He turned to leave.
Good evening, counsellor. Do be careful with your window. The church seems to have mislaid one. That night, rain came. Slow, persistent, cleansing nothing. Pubright sat by his lamp, the town muffled beyond the curtain, and considered the sequence of events, a staged fainting,
A vanished ring.
a conveniently missing record. The pattern was almost elegant. If Mrs. Broadspear had meant to shame Wykes publicly, she had done so perfectly. But why the second act, the break-in? Why silence when spectacle had been her weapon? He closed his eyes briefly, replaying her words, her posture, the faint tremor of fear when he'd mentioned insurance. Insurance. He opened his notebook and began to write, Mrs. B, no legal marriage. Marriage to Ernest void if prior wife alive. Certificate destroyed, Weeks' inheritance secure. He paused. If she discovered it herself, motive shifts. Fainting, panic, not theatre, rings removal, concealment, not message. He set the pencil down. The direction of his thoughts had turned, quietly and decisively. Perhaps Mrs. Broadspear's performance had not been triumph, but terror. Perhaps she had realized in that bright, crowded hall that her status as widow was built on a paper, foundation now missing from the parish drawer, and perhaps the fainting was less
Of a swoon, and more of a collapse into the
truth. The following morning brought confirmation of a sort. A letter arrived at the station, addressed in a cramped, unfamiliar hand.
no signature. Inside was a single sentence.
Neatly typed, if you would know the truth of Mrs. Broadspear, look beneath the ledger, not within it. Enclosed with it was a torn scrap of official paper, watermarked, faintly ink-stained, bearing the faded heading, Registry of Marriages, Flaxborough Parish, and faintly legible. The letters, Margaret Broadspear, née Wykes. Pubright folded it carefully. Then he smiled almost sadly. Beneath the ledger, he murmured.
Indeed, he stood, took his hat, and said to Lovey, Sergeant,
We may be about to find that Flaxborough's most respectable.
widow was never a wife at all, Inspector.
Pubright had a habit of thinking best in silence, and preferably over tea that had long gone lukewarm. By Saturday morning, the noise of the case had begun to subside again, replaced by that peculiar hush which always followed one of Flaxborough's small upheavals. The town was returning to its preferred state, an orderly garden of suppressed truths. He sat in his office, the blinds half drawn against a thin drizzle, and reviewed the week as one might study the faded petals of a bouquet that had once seemed fresh. The widow's ring had vanished, yes, but the real disappearance, he thought, was of certainty. Every statement contradicted another. Every motive folded politely over guilt and self-importance. It was not the theft itself that troubled him now, but the remarkable conformity with which everyone had lied about it, each person choosing an explanation that suited their sense of decency. He smiled faintly. In Flaxborough, honesty was always measured out like sugar, a teaspoon in public, a handful in private, and a lump kept back for emergencies. On his desk lay the fragment of the torn marriage record. It was fragile, smudged and faintly perfumed with mildew, yet in that decaying scrap of paper an entire facade had cracked open. Margaret Broadspear, née Wykes. So the first Mrs. Broadspear had indeed existed, and, by all appearances, the second had borrowed her name, her ring, and perhaps her security. It was a tidy arrangement while the record survived quietly in the drawer. But once someone, perhaps the widow herself, discovered its implications, the arrangement had become perilous. Pubright considered possibilities. If the widow had never been legally married, her inheritance was invalid. If she knew this, she had motive to erase the record. If someone else knew it, Councillor Wykes, perhaps, or the late husband's solicitor, they had motive to silence her, or at least remove the proof before scandal blossomed. And yet, the fainting at the flower show still puzzled him. That performance, or panic, had occurred in public. It was a cry for witnesses, not concealment. He tapped his pencil thoughtfully. Either she wanted everyone to see the ring one last time before it vanished, or she realized, in that instant, what the ring truly signified. Both explanations, he thought, might be true at once. He turned the pencil between his fingers and watched the rain streak down the window like lines of untidy handwriting. Flaxborough was not a wicked town. It was, in fact, a remarkably polite one. Its sins were rarely criminal. They were architectural. They lay in the structure of its respectability. People here committed little wrongs in the name of order. They forged signatures to spare embarrassment, lied to keep conversation civil, stole sentiment rather than money. And when those small lies tangled, as lies always did, they called it tragedy and spoke of God's mysterious ways. Pubright smiled ruefully. He often thought that God, in Flaxborough, must feel rather redundant. Sergeant Love entered quietly, a cup of fresh tea in hand. "You've been staring at that paper for an hour, sir," he said. "Must be quite the clue." "Not quite, Sergeant," said Pubright, taking the cup. "More of a mirror." Love frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning it shows everyone exactly what they prefer not to see." Love sat down, scratching his chin.
"I'll admit, sir, I still don't see why anyone go to all this trouble over a bit of paper. If the marriage wasn't real, couldn't the lady just—"
"Well, keep quiet about it." "She might have," said Pubright. "But respectability is a delicate animal, Sergeant. It must be constantly fed, and it dies of hunger faster than of shame." He leaned back. "Imagine, if you will, a woman who's built her life upon the assumption of virtue, the widow of a respected man, the pillar of a committee, the moral ornament of a small town. Now imagine she learns quite suddenly that her widowhood is invalid, that she is in law nobody, not a wife, not an heir, merely
"An interloper with lace curtains." Love gave a low whistle.
She'd panic. "Indeed," said Pubright, "or faint, which in Flaxborough is the same thing, performed with better posture." They sat in companionable quiet for a while, listening to the rain ticking against the window panes. Pubright sipped his tea, thinking of Mrs. Broadspear's face, the practiced sorrow, the deliberate dignity, and behind them, that flicker of calculation. He had met many like her, the town's professional mourners, whose grief doubled as currency. He recalled her house, the framed certificates, the brass nameplate, the spotless hearth, all the evidence of a life built not on love, but on presentation. It was not malice that drove such people, he thought. It was fear, the fear of being seen as ordinary, and yet, in seeking perfection, they often achieved the most exquisite form of deceit. "Do you think she's the culprit, sir?"
Love asked at last. "Culprit?"
Pubright smiled. "We're a little short on saints here, Sergeant. In this case, guilt appears to have been shared out quite democratically." He turned his notebook toward Love. On the open page were 4 neat names: Mrs. Gwendolen Broadspear, Councillor; Basil Wykes Eustace, Kellett Lionel Benthand. Beneath them, a single line. Each knew one part of the truth and feared the rest. Love nodded slowly. "So what now?" "Now," said Pubright, closing the book, "we wait. Guilt, like mildew, grows best in darkness. Given time, someone will open the curtain." That evening, as the last of the rain cleared, Pubright walked home through the damp hush of the high street. The lamps flickered in their glass cases, and the cobblestones reflected the world like a polished lie. He paused outside the jeweller's, then the vicarage, then the widow's house. Every window glowed faintly with the soft light of propriety, and behind each he imagined small movements, curtains twitching.
Voices lowered, letters burned. He felt no triumph.
Only the quiet melancholy of understanding too much about people and too little about peace. Flaxborough would survive this scandal, of course. It always did. The flowers would bloom next year, the Gazette would print cheerful lies, and Mrs. Broadspear, if she had any sense left, would wear no ring at all. But beneath that tranquil surface, something had shifted. Respectability, once cracked, never mended cleanly. It left hairline fractures, visible only in certain lights, exactly the sort of thing Inspector Pubright had trained his eye to notice. He reached his door, turned the key and murmured to himself, "The truth in Flaxborough is never lost. It merely learns to curtsy." He smiled faintly, stepped inside, and closed the door on the drizzle. Inspector Pubright believed that truth was best uncovered not through confrontation, but through conversation, ideally over refreshments. A lie, in his experience, could survive interrogation, but rarely survived politeness, and so, on Monday afternoon, invitations were discreetly issued for a brief discussion at the police station regarding the resolution of recent matters. The recipients were Mrs. Broadspear, Councillor Wykes, Mr. Bent the solicitor, and Mr. Kellett, the churchwarden. Each received the note with the same reaction: alarm, followed by relief that others had been invited too. By 3 o'clock, they were all seated in the small conference room adjoining Purbright's office, a space designed less for drama than discomfort. A large pot of tea occupied the centre of the table, flanked by 4 cups and a plate of plain biscuits that had clearly been opened earlier in the day. Pubright poured the tea himself, as though presiding over a genteel afternoon social rather than an inquest of reputations. "Now," he began pleasantly, "I thought it best that we gather in a spirit of, well, mutual tidiness. The town has been rather overexcited these past few days, and I believe it would be restful for everyone to have matters clarified." Mrs. Broadspear, who had dressed as though expecting an ambassadress's luncheon, inclined her head. "Quite right, Inspector."
This unpleasantness has gone on far too long. "Indeed," said Wykes, who looked as though he'd spent the weekend in sleepless arithmetic.
"I, for one, should like my good name restored." Pubright smiled. "How admirable of you both. And yet—" He stirred his tea gently. "Good names are curious things."
"They never seem to thrive on secrecy."
Mr. Bent adjusted his cuffs. "If you mean rumours, Inspector, I can assure you all documentation regarding the Broadspear estate is quite in order." "Ah, yes," Pubright said mildly. "Documentation."
"A subject of great interest, especially those that go missing." He looked toward Kellett, whose complexion had achieved a theological pallor.
"I understand, Mr. Kellett, that a certain marriage certificate was mislaid last week." The churchwarden cleared his throat. "Mislaid, yes, but I've since located it." "Located it?" Pubright echoed.
"How fortunate. And where was it found?" "In a drawer."
"Misfiled, I expect." "Indeed. Curious that it should be misfiled under C for confession." A small, strangled noise escaped Mrs. Broadspear. Pubright set down his cup. "Let us be honest, shall we? The ring, the record, the fainting, it all are chapters of the same little comedy. The difference is that the laughter has stopped." Bent bristled. "You speak as though there's been some deceit, Inspector." "Oh, quite a lot," said Pubright cheerfully. "Though not of the criminal variety, merely the domestic kind." He rose, moved to the window, and spoke without turning. "Some years ago, a man named Ernest Broadspear married a woman named Margaret Wykes, sister to our friend Councillor Wykes. The marriage was unhappy, but legitimate. Upon her death, Mr. Broadspear remarried Mrs. Gwendolen Broadspear here. Unfortunately, he neglected to settle certain property rights with his late wife's family. He turned back, smiling gently. The ring, however, did not neglect. It still bore its original inscription, M.W. Mrs. Broadspear's gloved hands trembled.
I didn't know, she whispered.
Not at first. Of course not, Pubright said. You only discovered the truth when the ring was cleaned, and the jeweller wisely refused to erase the initials.
I suspect that was when you began to understand your position. Bent frowned.
Position? Precarious, said Pubright. If the will were challenged, and if the original marriage record confirmed that certain effects, such as the ring, had been left to the first wife's heirs, then Mrs. Broadspear's claim to her late husband's estate might be disputable. There was a silence so taut that even the ticking of the wall clock seemed hesitant. Councillor Wykes broke it first.
That's nonsense.
My sister was long dead when Ernest remarried.
There's no scandal here. Indeed,
said Pubright. Then why break into the parish office to remove the record? Wykes's mouth opened, but no words emerged. Kellett's voice piped up instead. Thin, guilty.
He didn't break in. I did.
For him. All eyes turned. The churchwarden looked miserable, as if confessing to a minor heresy. He came to me, said there was a misunderstanding, that it would cause embarrassment to a respectable lady.
He asked if I might
tidy the files, just to save trouble. And you obliged, Pubright said softly. I thought it Christian. Pubright nodded.
A very convenient sort of Christianity. Mrs. Broadspear rose abruptly. So that's it, then?
You all conspired to make me the fool? Purbright's voice was calm. Not quite, madam. No one conspired against you. They merely conspired to preserve themselves. You were simply the most expendable symbol of respectability available. She stood rigid, then laughed. A brittle, weary sound. I fainted because I saw Basil slip the ring into his pocket. Not because I feared scandal, Inspector, but because I realized I had been erased twice.
Once by a husband, once by the truth. Wykes sprang up, face flushed. I was protecting you.
The will, the ring, the certificate, they would have ruined you. Ruined me, she said bitterly.
You mean they'd have ruined you? Her voice shook, but not with hysteria.
It was anger long deferred. Pubright watched them quietly as though observing a moral equation reach its conclusion. At last he spoke. This matter, I think, requires no further action.
No one will be charged.
The ring's disappearance will be recorded as mislaid property. The parish record, I trust, will be rediscovered and restored. He paused, eyes resting on Mrs. Broadspear. As for you, madam, may I offer one piece of advice? She blinked, wary. Yes? Stop fainting for people who prefer you unconscious. She gave a small, surprised laugh, then turned toward the door. I think, she said quietly, I shall sell the house and live somewhere that doesn't know my curtains. Councillor Wykes looked as though he'd swallowed a wasp. When they had gone, Sergeant Love slipped in, expression puzzled.
So that's it, sir? No arrests?
None necessary, Pubright said, pouring himself the last of the tea. There's been no crime, only the usual moral housekeeping, Love frowned. Still seems like someone ought to pay for something. They will, said Pubright. Reputation always sends its own bill. He glanced at the empty doorway where Mrs. Broadspear had stood. I suspect hers will be the cheapest. He smiled faintly, set down the cup, and reached for his hat. Come along.
Love. Let's see what becomes of the town when it runs out of other people's sins to discuss. The following Sunday afternoon found Flaxborough in its natural state. The calm that follows scandal.
When people speak softly, as though the air itself might be listening for gossip. The sun, faint and well-mannered, filtered through thin curtains at the vicarage drawing-room, where Inspector Pubright sat with Reverend and Mrs. Cramble, a plate of sandwiches, and 3 witnesses to human folly, Mrs. Broadspear, Councillor Wykes, And Sergeant Love. Mrs. Cramble, sensing drama, had insisted on the setting of moral propriety. She poured tea with reverent slowness,
As though the ritual itself might redeem the town. Pubright,
who disliked both fuss and sandwiches, waited until everyone was settled, then cleared his throat with a small cough that sounded remarkably like punctuation. "I think," he began gently, "we can now draw a line beneath the matter of the widow's vanishing ring. Not a bold line, of course, just a discreet one." In pencil, Mrs. Broadspear looked composed, though her gloves were missing and her fingers fidgeted unconsciously in her lap. Councillor Wykes, by contrast, resembled a man being forced to swallow a sermon. Pubright continued, tone mild but unrelenting. "The sequence of events, when viewed with the correct lens, is quite straightforward. A ring was displayed, then disappeared. A marriage record was removed, then returned. And in between, several people acted entirely out of character, though very much in keeping with their natures." Sergeant Love, notebook ready, leaned forward like an eager schoolboy. Pubright turned first to Mrs. Broadspear. "Your late husband, Mrs. Broadspear, was married twice, first to Margaret Wykes, then to yourself. Unfortunately, when he died, a few legal ambiguities remained unresolved, in particular the disposition of certain items,
including a gold wedding ring." She inclined her head.
Tight-lipped. "When you discovered the inscription in W, you realized the ring was not yours by right. You also realized that displaying it publicly would provoke Councillor Wykes, your late husband's brother-in-law and executor, to a most gratifying discomfort, which indeed it did." Wykes shifted in his seat, face a model of restrained outrage. Pubright went on, his tone still conversational. "You chose the flower show because it offered an audience. Respectability, after all, requires witnesses. You wore the ring prominently, touched it often, and waited for the right eyes to notice. Councillor Wykes saw it, and understanding its significance, panicked. He could not afford to have that ring discussed, photographed, or mentioned in public. "Pure fantasy," muttered Wykes, though not loudly. "Not quite," said Pubright. "You see, Mr. Chimes, the Gazette photographer, captured the moment your hand reached toward the widow's shoulder, and toward the ring. It was you, not a thief, who removed it." Love glanced up, wide-eyed. "So it was him all along, sir?" "Momentarily, yes," Pubright replied, "though to call it theft would be unfair. The councillor was simply removing a social embarrassment. Unfortunately, he failed to anticipate the consequences." Pubright turned his gaze toward Mrs. Broadspear, whose expression was somewhere between triumph and fatigue. "When you realized the ring had vanished, you fainted, either from genuine shock or the dreadful realization that you had, at last, achieved what you wanted, attention. The town's sympathy was secured, the councillor's anxiety confirmed, and your reputation, paradoxically, elevated."
"A widow too tragic to be questioned." She gave a small, brittle laugh.
"And yet, somehow, I still lost everything." "Not quite everything," said Pubright kindly. "You lost only the illusion that comfort and virtue are the same thing." Her eyes lowered. He turned to Wykes. "Afterwards, of course, came the more serious error. Fearing that the police might look too closely into your late brother-in-law's affairs, you persuaded our friend Mr. Kellett to tidy the parish records. That small act of clerical housekeeping, as it were, transformed a petty deceit into a full investigation," Wykes blustered.
"It was a misunderstanding."
"I merely wanted to prevent gossip," Pubright smiled thinly.
"Ah, yes."
The cause of all misdeeds in Flaxborough, the fear of gossip. He placed his cup on the saucer with a soft click. "What you failed to see, Councillor, is that gossip is our local form of truth. It may not always be accurate, but it never truly lies." There was a brief silence. Even Mrs. Cramble, who had begun to refill cups out of habit, paused mid-pour. Pubright glanced toward the window where late afternoon light shimmered faintly across the polished glass. "The ring, of course, was never lost. You returned it quietly, Councillor, through Mr. Bent?" who slipped it into the church donation box. Mr. Kellett, in turn, discovered it 2 days later and, being a man of discretion, handed it to the vicar, who placed it in a drawer labelled Miscellaneous Devotions. Mrs. Cramble blinked.
Good gracious.
Then all this time— Yes, said Pubright gently. The object everyone searched for was sitting beside the hymnals. Love chuckled softly, then grew solemn. But what about the break-in, sir?
Who took the record? Ah, said Pubright, that is the final courtesy of the tale.
The culprit in that instance was Mrs. Broadspear herself. She went to the parish office late one evening, unnoticed thanks to Mr. Kellett's misplaced trust, and removed her own marriage certificate, not to conceal it from others but to see it for herself. And when she did, she realized it proved nothing. Her marriage, you see, had never been properly registered. A hush followed. Mrs. Broadspear spoke softly. Then I was never his wife. In the eyes of the law, Pubright said, no. In the eyes of Flaxborough, yes, and perhaps that's punishment enough. The law merely denies property. The town denies sympathy. She exhaled slowly, the sound almost a sigh of relief. Pubright rose. There will be no charges. The law prefers clarity, and there is none to be had here. But I do suggest, Mrs. Broadspear, that you find a smaller town, one less inclined to remember things it doesn't understand. She stood, quietly composed. And you, Inspector? Do you ever tire of understanding things you can't change? Pubright smiled faintly.
Constantly.
But it's what keeps me in work. After the company had departed, leaving behind the smell of overbrewed tea and anxious perfume, Pubright and the vicar stood together by the window. You know, Reverend, said the inspector, it's an odd business. The truth here changed no one's life, yet somehow spoiled everyone's comfort. Cramble nodded. That's often its chief purpose. Outside, the town looked as it always did, prim gardens, polished brass, and the faint sound of hymns rehearsed for next Sunday's service. Pubright watched a small group of townspeople crossing the square. Heads close, voices lowered. No doubt the next scandal was already forming. Polite and inevitable as rain, he smiled, adjusted his hat, and said quietly, "The world, Reverend, runs not on sin nor virtue, but on the delicate hope that no one will ask which is which." And with that, he took his leave. By the time Monday's post arrived, the Flaxborough Gazette had already moved on. Page 1 was devoted to the Horticultural Society's plans for next spring, with only a brief paragraph tucked between the council minutes and a report on the Methodist jumble sale, noting that the matter of the ring at the flower show has been satisfactorily
resolved. No one asked precisely
how it had been resolved. Flaxborough never required details when
reassurance would do, Mrs. Gwendolen.
Broadspear departed town a week later. Her house, that respectable tomb of lavender, lace, and self-importance, was sold to a retired bank manager from Lincoln. The brass nameplate was polished off the gate, the curtains taken down, and her prized dahlias dug up by the new owner's wife on principle. She left quietly, with 2 trunks, a parrot cage, and the air of a woman who had at last escaped her own performance. The ring, now unclaimed, was returned to the church's lost property box, where it lay beside a small silver cross and an unpaired glove. The vicar's wife said they would find a use for it eventually. Councillor Wykes resumed his duties with unusual diligence, chairing committees and speaking sternly about morality in public service. He had the look of a man who wished to atone, though it was unclear for what. Rumour held that he had taken to walking the churchyard in the evenings. Some said he was visiting his sister's grave, others that he was calculating his soul's tax deductions. Either way, his voice grew quieter and his opinions mercifully shorter. Mr. Kellett, the churchwarden, became briefly famous for finding the missing parish record. The vicar congratulated him publicly. Privately, he forbade him from ever filing anything again, and as for the solicitor, Mr. Bent, he developed a sudden enthusiasm for gardening, perhaps in the hope that no one would ask questions of a man whose hands were always busy with dirt. Flaxborough itself recovered with the brisk resilience of a small town that has seen
everything and learned nothing. By midweek,
the talk had shifted to the Women's Institute cake stall, and Mrs. Glossop was once more discussing the proper consistency of Victoria sponge rather than moral decay. In the Cardew tea rooms, the same ladies who had once denounced Ivy Briggs now nodded approvingly as she served them scones. "Poor thing," Mrs. Glossop said, lowering her voice.
terribly maligned, of course.
"We always said she was innocent," Miss Peebles nodded solemnly. "I said so particularly." Ivy, overhearing, smiled faintly and refilled their teapot without comment. She was saving her wages, she told the baker later, for a small place in Lincoln, one with no silver to polish and no ladies to please. Inspector Pubright, meanwhile, sat in his office writing the final lines of his report. The typewriter clacked slowly, as if reluctant to part with the story. He paused midway through a sentence, smiled to himself and retyped it more precisely. Subject: the disappearance of a gold ring belonging to the late Mr. Ernest Broadspear. Outcome: no criminal proceedings. Observations: the incident originated not in greed but in embarrassment, and was concluded not by law but by fatigue. He signed it in his usual neat hand, C. Pubright, Inspector, and added a final line in pencil at the bottom of the page, not for official eyes. Theft unnecessary. Truth sufficient. He tore off the sheet, slid it into a folder, and closed the file with a soft thud. Outside, Flaxborough continued its clockwork rhythms. Children on bicycles rattled along the cobbled street. The milkman nodded to the constable. A dog barked, more from habit than conviction. Pubright leaned back in his chair and gazed at the ceiling, where a small crack ran diagonally across the plaster. It reminded him faintly of human nature, a flaw that never quite widened but never quite healed. He found the thought oddly comforting. Sergeant Love appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Tea, sir?" "Please," said Pubright, "and perhaps one of those plain biscuits."
I find they suit the mood, Love grinned.
"Another case closed, then." "Closed," Pubright agreed.
Though not necessarily concluded, Love frowned.
"You mean there's more to it?" Pubright smiled. "There's always more to it, Sergeant. But if we waited for the full truth, we'd never get anything filed." Love nodded as if this were wisdom, which, in Flaxborough, it was, and went off whistling tunelessly toward the kettle. Later that afternoon, Pubright took a slow walk through the Flaxborough gardens, where the last of the summer petunias were beginning to droop. A light breeze moved among them, stirring faint scents of soil and rain. He paused by a bed of dahlias in crimson and white and recalled, with wry affection, the widow's collapse among their predecessors. Even her fainting, he thought, had been carefully choreographed. But then, wasn't that the essence of Flaxborough? Everyone fainting in their own way, from truths too delicate to face standing up. A small boy chased a paper boat through the fountain's shallow basin. Pubright watched it spin once. Catch the light and sink, he smiled faintly and murmured, "Everything finds its level." When he returned home, the evening was falling. He hung his hat carefully on its peg, set the kettle on, and took down a thin book from the shelf, The Social Psychology of Politeness, a gift from an academic friend in Lincoln. He opened it idly, then closed it again. Flaxborough, he decided, was all the psychology he'd ever need. As the kettle began to whistle, he looked once more out at the dim street where windows glowed with their usual comforting deceit. He raised his cup toward them in silent salute. To hypocrisy, habit, and the fragile peace that held them all together. Then, quietly, almost contentedly, he said aloud to the empty room, "And that,
I suppose, is the end of the matter?"